The title of my message this morning is, did you ever need a do-over in your life where you wish you could go back and fix something? I'm not a very good golfer, and so when we go out, I demand at least a mulligan per 9 holes. A mulligan means that if you mess it up, you hit the ball, and in my case, it'll go 10 feet instead of 200 yards. You can say, I'm taking one of my mulligans that didn't count. It didn't count. I just want you to know that I think everyone needs a mulligan in life sometimes. There are so many things that I wish I could go back and start over. In the old days when I first started preaching, it was before all the computers. It was before all of those kind of things. So everything was handwritten or typed. And since I wasn't a very good typer, I mostly hand wrote. And there were times when Doris would come over to my office, and over in the corner there's 20 or 30 crumpled up pieces of paper because I started over. I wanted to get it right. The great thing about starting over, especially it's a new year. Happy New Year, by the way. It's not a great big thing for me. We don't celebrate it very much, but we aren't kind of that. But some people really make a big deal out of it. And what they do is they say, okay, this year's gone. There are all kinds of things this year that I didn't get done that I would have liked to have done. Or there were things this year that I did that I wish I wouldn't have done. I'm probably more in that category. We're going to look at the life of an individual who used a lot of mulligans. We're going to look at how God restores people even when we mess up. And I promise you, you'll mess up in your spiritual life. You'll mess up in relationships. Wife, husband, friends, co-workers, dad. You're going to do that. And there's going to be times when you'll think, oh, why did I say that? What can I do to fix it? Why did I consider that course of action which took me away from the Lord that I love, and now I got to try to fix it? If you have the outlines, it has the scripture references, but you're going to take a little walk with me through the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of John. Just short passages in each one. I won't read all of them, but I just want to get you to the place where you remember and where you think about in your own life. God's desire is to give us mulligans. He's the God of the second, third. He's the God of the 50th chance. I love him so much because he tells me that, yeah, Gary, you really did mess up there. But I love you, and here's how we can restore that relationship. When sin comes into my life, and it does, don't ever think whoever is up here behind the pulpit leads a sinless life. They're in it to their elbows just like you. Pastors are no different than you. And they struggle. And when I get to that spot, I need to know that there's some reassurance and that I know that there's some restoration. Some of you here today are looking for that. Maybe in a past relationship, maybe in your current relationship. You're looking for God's hand and for God's reassurance. Turn, if you would, to the Gospel of Mark in the 14th chapter. New Testament, Matthew, Mark, chapter 14. Letter A on your outline is the Passover dinner. The Passover dinner. Have you ever been to a dinner party where things got out of hand? I can remember the first Thanksgiving taking Doris to my family so they could meet her and we'd have dinner together. She quickly realized, unlike her family, that my family is pretty vocal around the dinner table. There were those who were very vocal about their politics. There were those that were vocal about everything. Sometimes, this is the truth, sometimes it not only got vocal, but rolls would fly. Seriously. It was crazy. It wouldn't be what you would expect in a good dinner party. Let me tell you, the Passover dinner wasn't what anybody expected. At Passover, take a listen in Mark 14, verses 12 to the first part of verse 18. Matthew 14, and I'm going to begin with verse 12. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go to make preparations for you to eat Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." The disciples left, went into the city, found things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table and eating, he said, "I tell you a truth." Let's stop right there. Passover dinner, absolutely essential in the life of a Jewish adult. They were required to celebrate Passover. They were required to prepare for it, sometimes days ahead. It's something that they looked forward to. It's something that they had great anticipation for God to do great things and to remember that Passover. You know what Passover was in Egypt. You know how God delivered the Israelites from the Egyptians by the blood placed over the top and the sides of the mountain. They wanted to go back and remember that. We remember this in the same way they remembered that. They stood back in awe of remembering what took place. Passover was essential. And by the way, they didn't understand it, but this would be that last Passover that he would celebrate with them. Even more significance. So don't you think it would have been a great occasion? Don't you think it would have been wonderful? What took place at that table? There was more chaos at that table than there was at the Kuhn family table. You say, how do you say that? Well, as they're eating, a couple of the disciples wanted to decide who was going to be the greatest. After all of the issues, after him washing their feet, he taught them, but they wanted to know who would be the greatest in the kingdom. What else took place? A guy named Judas was at the dinner table for part of that meal, and he was the one that was going to betray Jesus. And the disciples are saying, "Which one is it? Which one is it?" And he said, "The one I pass the bread to." And even at the dinner table, there's this great debate with Peter. Peter's taking a look at Jesus saying, "I'm going to go away. I'm going to be..." Peter, you're going to deny me. Matter of fact, after the Passover dinner, look at the predicted denials. I'm going to pick right up in Mark again, right where we were. And listen, in second part of verse 18, he says, "I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They were saddened, and one by one they said, "Surely it's not me." "It is one of the 12, he replied, "one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as is written about him, but woe to the man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." He said to them, "I tell you the truth, I will not eat, drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it anew in the kingdom of God." When they had sung a hymn, they went out. Listen to what is predicted. "You will fall away," Jesus told them. "For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." And Peter says, No. Even if everybody else falls away, I will not. "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered. "Today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. And Peter, as always, Peter is arguing with the King of glory, arguing with the Savior of the world, arguing with the one who would soon redeem him. Emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I'll never disown you." And all the others said the same. Did you notice there were 2 predictions there? We emphasize on Peter, but in that first verse he said, you're all going to fall away. When push comes to shove, when the heat hits the pan, you guys are all going to run away. You're going to leave me. You're going to listen to the voices. You're going to act in fear, and you're going to run. Did they? Yeah, sure did. When things got rough, when Caiaphas's messengers and court soldiers and temple guards all showed up, they took off running. The prediction was, you're all going to go, but particularly Peter. Here's the guy that's going to be the leader of the church. He's not the Pope, but he's going to be the one that God chose to lead those individuals. He's the one who has been up front most of the ministry, hasn't he? He's been the one who's speaking out. He's been the one that's doing the leading. He's been the one that everybody kind of looked up to. He's the one that Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church. And he's the one that most emphatically stands up. And I got to believe it was probably just as heated as it was around our table. I got to believe that there was a pretty heated exchange, at least on Peter's part. And I want you to understand something. It wasn't private. They were all there. All of them couldn't believe that they would deny him. But after Peter stood up, they all kind of chimed in, no, we won't do that. But Peter was the one that said, I'll follow you to death. Nothing can separate the bond that you and I have. I've given my life these last 3 years. I gave up my fishing business with my family. I gave all of those things up, and I'm going to die with you. Predicted denials. Then I want you to look, if you would, to turn to the Gospel of Luke with me. Matthew, Mark, Luke. The great doctor, Luke, writes some things about those denials that are, well, they shake me up pretty good. Luke chapter 22, and verses 54 to 60. Listen to what Luke says. Then, seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. But when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are also one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Look at verse 60. Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. Public denials. Matter of fact, some of the other Gospels say he cursed. He was vehement in saying, "You're mixed up. You don't know." Why did they say he was Galilean? They had a different dialect, a different accent. It's still that way now in Galilee. They had a certain dialect, a certain way of... Let me put it this way. Have you ever been down south? Oh, yeah. Talk about different dialect. There are times I got to make them repeat it twice. But I will tell you this, and my wife's here, so it's safe. But boy, girls that talk that way just kind of melted my heart. She's from South Dakota. That South doesn't have anything to do with an accent. I can remember at Bible college, one of her friends came up and said, "Where are you from?" "Well, I'm from South Dakota." "Well, how come you don't have an accent?" Do your geography lesson. Tell you why there's no accent. Here it was, Peter in front of them at the spot, and the denials were public. People heard it. People knew it. People wrap themselves around it. Listen, when things happen publicly, please pay attention. When sin is a public sin, when sin gets to the place where lots of people know about it, when it shows itself, then there needs to be public restoration. There needs to be public recognition. Peter took a step back, and in the midst of all of that, got a short memory, doesn't he? I'll give him a little credit. He was the only one close enough to see Jesus during all this. The rest of them went further away. But Peter's in the courtyard just outside Caiaphas' house. I sat on those steps, by the way. The original steps that go up to Caiaphas' house. And Peter's in the courtyard, and he's watching, and he's listening, and he's trying to hear things, and he's sitting in front of a fire. And people recognize him. And instead of taking the opportunity to do like he said, he runs the other way. Take a look at this whole weekend. Look how Peter has slowly walked away. Do you remember in the garden he was asked to pray? What did he do? Slept. He's one of the three that fell asleep. They're in the garden Jesus comes from. And what does Peter do? Takes out a sword and cuts off the ear of Malchus. Peter runs with everyone else. Peter was at a spot where he began, and you're going to see this in a minute, I believe he began to question whether he was even worthy to serve the king. Have you ever been there? Listen to me. There are times in my whole life that I can't believe Jesus loves me enough to put up with me. I can't believe the times I haven't openly denied, but I have to tell you that there have been seasons in my life where I certainly didn't stand up for him. Maybe none of you have been there, but I'm willing to wager most of you have. That's where the situation is. Peter's out there. He's standing there. The denials are public. He's said it in lots of people. But then I want you to look in verses 61 to 62. I want you to look at the personal devastation. Boy. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. What did he do? He went out and wept bitterly. One of the most pointed scenes of all the scripture, and it usually gets glossed over. Peter's out there close enough to see Jesus being questioned by Caiaphas and the leaders. Peter is near enough to maybe even hear some of the conversation. And then the cock crows. Do you think that was a rooster? It wasn't. Let me tell you a little bit about that. It probably wasn't the voice of a bird. In fact, in Caiaphas' court, because of purity, because of things, they didn't let roosters and things around. That was the Jewish law, the Jewish reason. You know what it probably was? At that hour, 3 o'clock, the Roman guard in the castle of Antonia changed. And whenever it changed, the trumpet blew. The trumpet blew. And you're saying, well, what does that have to do with anything, that the trumpet blew? Well, the Latin for that trumpet was called Gallicinium, and it means cockcrow. Every day, especially during Passover, that took place. And it took place at 3 o'clock. The Romans did things by hours. First watch, 9 to 12, second. As they went through that, and at 3 o'clock, that's exactly what happened. If you're kind of doubting me, take a look if you would. Hold your finger there and go back to Mark chapter 13. Mark chapter 13. And let me read 35 to 37 to you. Mark 13. Everybody there? Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. Those are the symbols of the hours that were broken up. And when the guard changed at 3 o'clock, the trumpet blew. The rooster doesn't go and crow at all those times. No, the trumpet for the Roman guard changed. It signified and went all through the city of Jerusalem. The cock crowed, and Peter knew. When that trumpet went off, he knew exactly what he had done. Oh, the personal devastation. The pain that had to go into his heart. And I don't think, you think Jesus looked at him with disgust or anger? No. He loved Peter. He knew Peter's tendencies. He knew Peter's ability to sometimes speak before he thought. And he loved Peter. As they looked, can you imagine looking just into the eyes of Jesus for a moment? Jesus looked out the courtyard as the guards are around him. As Peter stood there, sat by the fire, they looked out and their eyes met. You got any imagination at all? Can you imagine that? This man that spent 3 years walking with Jesus and seeing him perform miracles. This man who has pledged allegiance to Christ and loved him. This man who said he would die looks in the eyes, and it had to be devastating. Listen to me. Those times we do the same thing. Jesus doesn't look at us with disgust. He doesn't look at us with anger. He looks at us with disappointment, but always in love and acceptance. If you don't believe me, as we follow through this, you're going to see that's the scriptural truth. I often imagine when we get to glory and those of us who are born again believers, and we stand at the judgment seat, not for sin, but for what we've done after we were saved and whether it's worthy or not, I believe we're going to look him in the eye. I really do. And at that moment, the whole world wouldn't matter. At that moment, Peter was looking Jesus in the eye and looking back, and at that moment, his whole world collapsed. We make the best plans sometimes in life, don't we? We're going to do this. Our kids are going to go to this college. This is going to happen. I was pretty devastated last night after the Michigan game. Didn't look in Jesus' eyes, but I was trying to find Schembechler or their coach last night. Where in the world's Harbaugh? Let me look in his eyes. You know exactly what I'm talking about. There have been things in our lives that have devastated us. But God always provides a way back. He is such a gracious and loving and kind God that as he looked at Peter, it wasn't, well, I can't wait to have a conversation and humiliate him. It wasn't with that same, if you've been married long enough, you've heard these words. They're 4 very important words. I told you so. You got to remember that being married. If you haven't heard that, your marriage, I don't know about you. I've done that with her. She's done that with me. That was not a part of the Spirit of Jesus Christ as he looked into the eyes of Peter. He didn't say, okay, we're done now. I told you it was going to happen. It's happened. And now I got to find somebody else to lead my church, to lead these disciples, and take care of my people. Wasn't even a thought in Jesus' mind. Those public denials and those things that took place. And the personal devastation in Peter's life was just amazing. I got to tell you, I think, this is my opinion, not thus saith the Lord, okay? I got to tell you, I think at that moment, in a minute we'll look at something else, I think that the decisions Peter made from that time in his life were based on his unworthiness, based on his low opinion of who he was, based on his unworthiness, and I think he made some further decisions based on that. Let's take a look in John chapter 21. I made it easy for you. You don't have to keep going back. But John chapter 21. We looked at the Passover dinner, the predicted denials, the public denials, the personal devastation. In John 21, 1-3, remember, Peter's walking through a difficult time. Remember, Peter, this is post-resurrection. Peter has seen Jesus. Peter has talked to Jesus. Peter has been with Jesus within the resurrection. But never in any of that places was Peter completely singled out. Thomas was. I got to think that Peter didn't initiate certain things. When you're ashamed of something, how do you act? When you're ashamed of something you've done, what do you do? When there's a relationship that has been broken, we sometimes let shame stop us from restoration. We all do. There was an individual in our church, it's not important to share his name, at Georgetown, and we had some disagreements about leadership. We had some disagreements, and he left pretty angry and said some pretty unkind things about me, about my wife, about ministry. And it hurt deeply. But I looked at that and I said, now how am I supposed to respond? Whenever we'd meet in a restaurant, or I'd see him in a restaurant, I went out of my way to go up and say, hey, I miss you. I miss that relationship. Most of the time, he'd get up and leave. But I wasn't going to allow the shame or the pain of that for me not to do the right thing. Most of us, when we get to that spot, we don't handle it well. Peter didn't handle it well. How do I know that? John chapter 21, verses 1 to 3. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, that would be John and James, and 2 other disciples were together. Listen to what Peter says. I'm going fishing, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. You say, well, why is that? Jesus called Peter away from that business. Listen to me, fishing for them wasn't recreational. Those of you that fish, we can go out in the boat, cast the line, it's relaxing, it's fun. That wasn't the case for these guys. When they went fishing, it was a lot of work. Huge nets that had to be cleaned and maintained. And they worked because it was the way to make a living. What did Peter do before Jesus called him? He was a fisherman. He had a fishing business, probably with his father. John and James had a fishing business. They did that not for fun, not for relaxation, but to pay the bills and take care of their families. You don't have to read between the lines much to say, Peter's thinking about going back. Peter's thinking about, I'm a good fisherman. When we go through struggles and we go through times that are hard, we go to what's comfortable. We go for what's comfortable. He was comfortable as a fisherman. He was good at being a fisherman. He didn't mess up as a fisherman. And here he is, supposed to be waiting for the coming of Jesus again. And he says, you know what? I'm going fishing. I'm out of here. And he's such a good leader, the rest of them followed him. Even in that. I believe Peter thought, I don't know that I can be useful anymore. I'm not sure that God can use me. Listen, I don't care what you've done in life. God can still use you. Yep, even if you've been divorced. God forgive the church for shooting their wounded. God forgive them. There have been times in our lives where we have done things that we may think eliminate us from serving. No. Now, agreed, when pastors sin publicly, they may have to step away from the pulpit. They may have to go through a plan of restoration, but many times they can go back. Sometimes they can't. But there isn't a person, not a person, sitting in this room as I look out at faces that God doesn't desire to use in spite of your past, in spite of denials, in spite of betrayal, in spite of where you are. He's going to look in your eye and say, I got stuff for you to do. Amen. Quit rolling around in self-pity. Quit comparing yourself to what people think. Jesus desires to place you back into some type of service for him until you die. What a pitiful decision that was. What a bad choice. And up until this point, Peter's made a lot of bad choices. We've looked at them. The decision was, I think maybe I'll go do what I'm comfortable with. I'm thinking I can still do this, and God, God can find somebody else maybe to lead. I can remember going through a very particular down time of ministry for me, and things were struggling. Church was going well, but I was having some personal struggles especially when we first came to Georgetown. When I was up in Irons, 2 churches. You either went to ours or the Catholic Church. Or you drove 25 miles. I come down to Georgetown, there is literally a church on every corner. They were everywhere. And I got to tell you, they had pastors there that made me look like nothing in their ability to preach. I was pretty intimidated. You could ask, I was pretty insecure. And God instead of saying, shame on you, all he did was say, Gary, I'm not asking you to be this guy. I'm not asking you to do this thing. I'm asking you to serve me with your abilities and let me make your abilities supernatural. That's what he does with us. Peter was at the spot, maybe somebody else could do this better. Pitiful decision. But John 21, verses 15 to 19, is the public deliverance. How did Peter sin? What did he do? Did he do it in private? What did he do? We just talked about it. He did it publicly. He did it in front of other disciples. He did it in front of people in the courtyard. Everybody knew that he made that declaration. When he said, I'm going to die for you, he was standing with the other 10 guys. Judas had left. But he was standing with them. They all heard it, and they all knew that he tripped over himself. And Jesus, in his grace and mercy, let me read chapter 21, verses 15 to 19. You all know the story. Jesus is on the shore. They're out fishing. They didn't catch anything. He says, cast it on the other side to remind Peter, hey, remember when we got started? Remember when we first met? Remember when I called you? I'm going to give you a little remembrance. This is how we met, and we're going to do it again. And you're going to come to shore, and you're going to sit around a fire, just like he was sitting around the fire in the courtyard. All those details come into the restoration of that man, Peter. Listen to what he says. When they finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. And then he goes on to tell him what's going to happen in the future. And by the way, he tells him how he's going to die. And he said, even in that, you're going to glorify me. Peter, you may not think you have the right stuff. I'm telling you, in your life and in your death, you're going to glorify me. I have the confidence. I am going to stand with you, and your life will glorify Jesus Christ. In that exchange about love, and we've talked about the different words, the phileo and the agape love. We've talked about that even many times. But I want you to know that Peter receives a public approval. The disciples are all there. Remember all the guys who went fishing? They're all there listening. They're all there watching. And they're hearing Jesus say to Peter, who denied him, you got things to do, and I love you. Matter of fact, let me tell you, I think he gives him the greatest privilege in all of the world. You say, what's that? Jesus loves the church. He loves his sheep, and he doesn't want to entrust it to people that he can't trust. He said, Peter, I love you, and I'm trusting you with the most important thing in my life, the church, the people, the sheep. You got to feed them, and you got to take care of them when I'm gone. What a public restoration. Peter's delivered from that pity and sorrow. Peter's delivered from that mentality of failure. Peter's delivered from being put on a shelf and not being used. Feel like you're on a shelf this morning? Feel like you can't be used? Feel like somebody else can do it better? Feel like those choices you made as a young man or a young woman, or even now, that those things have disqualified you? Listen to me. The only one that's disqualified you is yourself. Jesus got around that with Peter, didn't he? My friend, I'm entrusting to you one of the most precious things in my life. My sheep. I shared with you before, and it's one of the most powerful. illustrations in my life. When I was struggling with ministry, there was this pastor's wife. The pastor, wonderful guy, he had died a few years earlier, and I still kept in touch with Marie. Her name is Marie Sanders. She's long been with the Lord. And I was going through a difficult time and happened to stop over to pray with her. And she could just, you know how some people can just sense that? You know, people in your life that they just got to look at you and they know something's not right. They know you're carrying a burden of some kind. She was one of those folks. And I was sharing with her how I was struggling with ministry and not sure that I could keep going. And there was an opportunity that had come up for business that I could make 4 times what I was making as a pastor. And I may have shared this before, but I want you to, it impacted my life so much. She said, "Oh, Gary, if God has called you to be a shepherd and a pastor, don't stoop to be a king. Don't stoop to be a king." What he was entrusting to Peter in that restoration was, you got it, Peter. You got this. Move on. You got this. I don't know where you are this morning, but if you're not where Peter was, you have been, and you probably will be, where you know you've disappointed him. He's not done with you. Don't ever think that. He loves you. He wants you to serve him, and he will be your advocate and mediator in glory. There will not be an accusation made against you because he's there standing, I paid for that. Remember that this week when an opportunity comes to serve, when those things take place.